Not all scars show. Not all wounds bleed. Some scream silently, buried deep inside, hidden even from the one who carries them. Imagine being trapped in a burning house, but no one sees the fire. You're screaming, but the world only hears silence. That's what addiction feels like. To those on the outside, it looks like self-destruction. But on the inside, it's a desperate attempt to survive something far worse than death, a life that no longer feels livable. Carl Jung once said, "All neurosis is a substitute for legitimate suffering." And Gabor Maté, a physician who has spent decades working with the most vulnerable addicts, echoes this truth. The question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. This is the wound behind the addiction. Not a moral failure, not a chemical hijacking of the brain, but an unacknowledged, often unseen psychic injury. One so deep that the only way to live with it is to numb it. But where does it begin? Usually it begins in childhood, when the soul is soft and absorbent like a sponge. A child doesn't just feel pain, they become it. Every time they're neglected, criticized, or emotionally abandoned, it doesn't just hurt, it redefines who they are. The child doesn't say, "My environment is broken." They say, "I am broken." And so the first wound isn't the drug. It's not the alcohol. It's shame. A shame so insidious that it fuses with their identity. They no longer feel pain. They become it. They wear it like skin. And as they grow older, that pain needs a release valve, something to make the silence go away. That's when the escape enters. The bottle, the needle, the high. Not to feel good, but to finally feel nothing. Gabor Maté says addiction is not a choice. It's a response to overwhelming emotional pain that has no other outlet. And in a society that punishes vulnerability, addicts are not seen as wounded, they're seen as weak. But Carl Jung offers a radically different view. He believed that addicts, rather than being lost causes, were lost seekers. People who had been severed from their inner selves, searching in substances what they could not find in the soul. He once said that addiction is a spiritual thirst for wholeness. This is what makes addiction so misunderstood. It's not about pleasure. It's about pain that has nowhere to go. So the next time you see someone struggling, ask yourself this: what kind of wound must they be carrying that this is their only relief? Because behind every addiction, there is a wound that never bled, but never stopped hurting. First, it felt like relief. Then, it became routine. Then it became the only way to breathe. No one plans to fall into addiction. It doesn't begin with a decision. It begins with a need to silence what can't be spoken, to escape what can't be endured. And the tragedy is, the very thing that offers freedom at first becomes the most beautiful prison. It's almost invisible in the beginning. The drink that makes the noise fade. The pill that hushes the panic. The hit that brings 5 seconds of peace. It works until it doesn't. Gabor Maté has seen this firsthand, over and over again. In the alleys of Vancouver's downtown east side, in high-powered professionals, in mothers, sons, veterans. He describes addiction as an attempt to escape suffering that's buried so deeply that the addict doesn't even recognize it as trauma. It just feels like life is too much, and the only way out is through a substance that takes the edge off reality. But slowly, the edges blur. The thing that once gave you control begins to control you. You need more to feel less. The doses increase. The high fades faster, and worst of all, the shame grows heavier, not just for using, but for needing it. Carl Jung would call this the moment when the shadow takes over. The addict becomes split. There's the self they show. We reject the addict because they remind us of something unbearable, the part of ourselves we spend our lives trying to hide. It's easy to point at the addict, to shake our heads. to whisper about poor choices and lost causes. But there's a reason addiction frightens us beyond logic. It reflects something most people don't want to admit. We're all running. We're all numbing. We're all addicted to something. The man passed out on the sidewalk and the executive checking their phone for the 100th time have more in common than we care to believe. One escapes with heroin, the other with emails, with endless scrolling, with food, perfectionism, validation. Different tools, same purpose, to avoid pain, silence, emptiness. Gabor Maté makes it uncomfortably clear. Addiction is a spectrum, and if you look closely, you'll see how socially accepted addictions are just quieter cries for help. He says, "We live in a society that not only tolerates addiction, but encourages it, so long as it's productive." Carl Jung's work echoes this eerie familiarity. He believed that the parts of ourselves we fail to confront, our anger, grief, fear, vulnerability, don't disappear. They become the shadow. And if we don't face that shadow consciously, it controls us from the dark. That's why we fear the addict, because they're the shadow exposed. They wear the desperation we disguise. They collapse in public the way we collapse in private. What if the addict isn't the outcast? What if they are the identified patient of a deeply unwell culture? A culture where people smile through agony, perform through exhaustion, and numb their humanity for the sake of fitting in. Addiction, in this light, becomes not an isolated sickness, but a collective mirror. And the ones who fall the hardest are often the most sensitive, the most unprotected, the ones who tried to cope without armor. So the next time we see an addict and feel judgment rise, we should pause, not to pity them, but to ask, what are we running from? Because the addict doesn't terrify us because they're so different. They terrify us because they're not. Healing is not becoming someone new. It's remembering who you were before the world told you to forget. The wound is not the end. Addiction is not the final chapter. It only feels that way when you're in the middle of it, when the silence screams louder than anything else and the pain seems infinite. But Carl Jung and Gabor Maté both point toward something radical and often misunderstood. The wound doesn't disqualify you from healing. It's where the healing begins. Most people believe that recovery is about stopping the substance, but recovery is not about quitting the drug. It's about understanding what made the drug feel like salvation in the first place. It's not about cutting off the symptom. It's about facing the story underneath it. The story of pain, of abandonment, of inner fragmentation, and ultimately, of forgetting one's own worth. The inner split Carl Jung believed that addiction and many forms of psychological suffering emerged from a split within the self, a rupture between the persona we show the world and the self we bury beneath. It Jung called the journey of healing individuation, the process of making the unconscious conscious. It is not an easy path. It demands brutal honesty. It requires you to sit in the same room with your own pain without running. For the addict, this means turning inward to confront the trauma that was once too terrifying to name. Maté reinforces this idea by saying that the real healing doesn't come from clinics or cold turkey abstinence. It comes from compassion. The opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And the most vital connection we lose is the one with our own inner child, the one who was neglected, ignored, or violated long before the first high. The nervous system remembers. It's easy to speak about trauma in poetic terms. But Gabor Maté grounds his insights in neuroscience. Trauma lives not just in the mind, it lives in the body. The nervous system becomes wired for survival, not safety. It learns to anticipate pain. It becomes hypervigilant, withdrawn, aggressive, or numb. An addict's body doesn't just crave the drug, it needs it to feel normal, because without it, the body remembers every unprocessed wound. This is why real recovery can't be forced through willpower alone. You can't punish the nervous system into safety. You can't shame someone into healing. Only compassion can do that. Only presence. Only love. Especially the kind the addict never received when they needed it most. The culture of disconnection. We live in a world that rewards masks. Where pain is pathologized. Where productivity is valued over presence. And where vulnerability is seen as weakness. In this environment, addiction is not an anomaly. It is the logical response to a culture that disconnects us from ourselves. Maté calls this out unapologetically. We are treating addicts like criminals for responding in the only way they know how to an unbearable life. This section of the journey is not just about the individual, it's about the society that failed them. If we want fewer addicts, we need to build a world where it's safe to feel, to cry, to be held in our darkness instead of condemned for. It's the role of community in recovery. No one heals in isolation. Just as trauma happens in relationship, healing happens in relationship. Carl Jung understood this in a spiritual way. He believed that healing came when the individual recognized their inherent wholeness, even if they felt shattered. He saw therapists, mentors, even close friends as midwives of that awakening. Gabor Maté goes further. He emphasizes community, safe environments where the nervous system can learn a new rhythm, where addicts are not treated as broken, but as people who adapted to impossible pain with the only tools they had. In such spaces, the addict no longer feels like a problem to be fixed. They feel like a person finally seen. And that seeing, that true seeing, is what begins to stitch the soul back together. Not a hero's journey, but a human one. It's tempting to romanticize the recovery story. The fall, the rock bottom, the comeback. But that's a Hollywood script. Real recovery is not linear. It is not glamorous. It is not clean. It's slow, messy, uncomfortable. Sometimes boring, sometimes humiliating, and often it feels like you're going backward before you can move forward. But it is real, it is possible, and it is worth it. Both Jung and Maté teach us that the goal is not perfection, it's integration. The recovering person doesn't erase their past, they learn how to carry it, they make peace with it, and over time that pain becomes part of their wisdom. They don't become someone new. They remember who they were before the world taught them to hide. The addict as teacher. This is where we flip the narrative entirely. The addict is not a warning sign. They're a guide, a mirror, a prophet of a society that has lost its soul. And if they survive, if they find their way back, they become the kind of human we all aspire to be. Honest, whole, unapologetically real. Maté often says that those who've walked through addiction and come out the other side carry a depth that few people ever touch. They have stared into the abyss and returned, and they carry with them the medicine of empathy, wisdom, and radical truth. Jung would call this the wounded healer. Those who transform their suffering into service, who help others not from theory, but from having walked the fire themselves. Forgiveness. The final door, one of the most powerful moments in recovery, comes not when the addict forgives others, but when they forgive themselves. That is the final door. It doesn't come quickly. It can take years. But when it opens, everything changes. The shame loses its grip. The past softens. The future no longer feels like a threat. Forgiveness is not saying it didn't hurt. It's saying, I no longer carry it as my identity. It's saying, I was wounded, but I am not the wound. A new kind of strength. In the end, this journey is not about getting stronger in the traditional sense. It's about becoming soft enough to feel again, brave enough to be real, connected enough to belong. The addict does not need to be saved. They need to be seen, to be heard, to be met exactly where they are, without judgment. And when someone dares to look into their eyes and say, "You are not broken, you are in pain, and you are not alone," that's when the real healing begins. Closing thought. The hidden wound behind every addiction is not a mark of weakness. It is the soul's cry for reconnection. And when that cry is finally heard, not silenced, not medicated, but heard, the wound doesn't disappear. It becomes sacred because that's where wholeness begins. Final one-line CTA. Until the wound is heard, the addiction will keep speaking for it.